everyone, I'm Elise Thompson-Richards, Editor-in-Chief of Food Engineering. In this interview, I'm chatting with Samara Heaggans, Director of Process Quality Engineering for Feastables, in recognition of International Women in Engineering Day. Higgins shares her college experience, her work at both major food companies and startups, and the importance of mentoring. Let's get into it. Thanks, Samara, so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this.
And so I'd like to start by getting to know you a little bit better. What drew you to engineering and the STEM field?
Wow. Well, I was always interested in science. I was a Star Trek kid. I loved Star Trek and, Mr. Spock and being chief science officer always looked really cool. The mad scientist role in movies was always what interested me. As I went through school, I always liked the sciences. And I had a great chemistry professor and teacher in high school. So that really made me really want to pursue chemistry or something chemical related. And so that's how I'll tell my story. I started to look at schools, and back then, my guidance counselor, they sit you down. They did not have the computers or internet, and he had a big book of careers. And I said, oh, I want to go to college, and I want to, I'm only going to do 4 years. I didn't want to do any extra school. And I said, I want to study chemistry. I love chemistry. I was good at math, didn't like it per se or love it, but I was good at math. So I said, oh, I can do chemistry. And he went across to a BS, 4 years in chemistry and down, and the type of work they did and how much money they made. And I said, that's not enough. And we went over to a master's. This is extra school, and it still wasn't the type of work I wanted to do or the money. Went all the way over to PhD, which was a lot of extra school, but it was the type of work I wanted to do, research, um, things like that. And it was the right money. And I was like, but wait, that's too much school. The next row down was chemical engineering, BS, the type of work they did, and how much money they made. And I said, that's what I'm doing, chemical engineering. So that's how I went into chemical engineering. And then I studied it. I went to college for that. Realized I didn't like a lot of the basics. I did a lot of internships. So thankfully, I went to a school that was very strong, had a lot of strong connections with research institutions, NASA, businesses. So I was able to intern every single year, freshman year, sophomore year, and junior year. Unfortunately, I realized I didn't like any of those. So my freshman year, I interned at NASA, Langley Air Force Base, and I worked on superconductors, which are these, end up being like magnets, and they ended up being the tiles for the space shuttle. It was so boring. I could not. I was just like, there's no way I could do this type of research. The next summer, I worked at AT&T Bell Labs before they broke it up. It was this huge behemoth research institution that was world renowned. People from all over the world went to work there and study and do research. And I worked on viscoelastic fluids, which are extremely thick liquids. And now they have instruments and things to do this, but it was my job to determine the viscosity of these things. So I'd put them in a glass viscometer and watch and time it with a stopwatch. I'd sit there on a stool and time these liquids. It would take over an hour for some of them to move to the next level. And I would fall asleep and have to do it over again. Those eventually became fiber optic lines. However, hated it. Couldn't. I was like, I cannot see myself doing this as a job. Uh, the next summer, I realized I needed something more hands-on. I ended up interning at Exxon in Baytown, Texas. So I worked in the summer in a pilot plant doing basic chemicals, and it was hot. It's dirty. At the time, the oil and gas and chemical industry was it had a lot of issues and a lot of accidents, and it wasn't the safest, or to me, in my mind, it wasn't the safest. If there were a couple of explosions that summer, and I realized, oh, not for me. And then I got scared. So I'm in my senior year, chemical engineering, about to graduate, realized I don't like any of these basic industries. What am I going to do? And I did two research projects. One was in biochemical engineering, which was a brand new field at the time, and the other was in food. And I said, okay, I like the biochemical, I like them both. I did research papers on them and we went to visit like a peanut processing facility. And I was like, not cool, not as cool or Star Trekky as biochemical engineering. So I said, okay, I'm going to go to grad school, learn more about this field, and this is what I want to do. So I went to grad school and I started doing the research and realized I did not like like just basic research, academia, writing proposals for grants, and I got a full 4 year fellowship and everything. I was like, I don't want to do this. But I did study biochemical engineering. Immunology. I did another internship with Dow Chemical, first in their agricultural chemicals. Again, pesticides, insecticides. Did not like it. Went on to do the next summer. I interned in pharmaceuticals, which I liked, and it was in line with my field and what I wanted to do. But by the second summer, another year in, I realized I did not want to get my PhD. I was tired of being a broke graduate student. So I went and worked in chemical or in a pharmaceutical industry for a pharmaceutical company studying what I worked on, which was biochemical engineering, virology, developing vaccines for extremely dangerous diseases. At the time, they were the worst diseases known to man, retroviruses. And I realized I did not like the pharmaceutical industry at all. After a year and a half, I was like, I cannot do this one more day. I had literally tried almost, it felt like to me, every industry out there except for food. One of my friends had gotten a job with Frito-Lay in Dallas, Texas, and said, we're hiring, come interview, at least we could hang out for the weekend. So I went down there and nobody ever died from a potato chip unless they're like guzzling the bag and then you choke. That's your fault. But a potato chip, a corn chip, nobody ever died from that. The chemicals weren't harsh. There weren't any accidents. Nobody caught fire. So I ended up going to work for Frito Lay, and I've been in the food and beverage industry for decades now. So it clicked. It finally clicked. That's what I like to do, and that's how I ended up in food and beverage.
Wow, that's quite the process of elimination that you went through, but at least you knew what you didn't like and what you liked.
Mhm.
But I want to back up a little bit and ask about your class makeup. How would
Okay.
you describe it when you were in college or even in your grad program, as far as the diversity in your class?
Well, I did go to an HBCU. I went to Hampton University. So it is a historically Black college. There were people there from all over the world. There were people, all different races, ethnicities, you name it. They went there. But for the class makeup, there weren't, freshman year, there were a few more women. I'd say, I said my biggest class maybe had 8 to 12 women. And as you get further along in the program, the women start to change their majors. They start to drop and move into different things. And I'd say as the years went on, it was like, okay, there's 3 of us. Okay, there's 2 of us. And then, okay, I'm the only one. So it was a very male dominated, it still is, but there are more women joining. There are always a few more women in chemical engineering, which is great. Good to see. We did have female professors, which was great. Not everybody had that. So I think I was very fortunate to learn from some really great professors too.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And being one of a few women, or maybe even the only one, what was it like, learning in that environment?
Actually, I would say, I guess like you could say I was always a tomboy growing up and I was always into sports and things like that. So to me, it was just, this is how it is. I learned to, you do have to learn to speak up for yourself. Um, the guys would joke, play really bad pranks sometimes, and you had to learn to give as, to me, give as good as you got. But it helped me to realize I have a voice and, follow your intuition. And a lot of times, at first it was like, oh, there are all these guys. And at one point, we were in a study group, and one guy actually like went down the row and said, "You're gonna drop, you're gonna drop, you're gonna drop," and pointed at me and said, "You're definitely gonna drop." And it kind of motivated me to say, "No, I'm not." And actually, he ended up dropping, but it made me realize, just because they've been there or they're used to it or they know someone who was a chemical engineer doesn't mean they're the smartest in the room. It doesn't mean they know everything. And a lot of times I ended up being the top of the class. So it made me find my voice, own that, speak up for myself, and realize you have to learn how to work with people in all their different personalities.
Wow, a little bit of karma there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so fast forwarding back to Frito-Lay,
Okay.
what were some of the projects that you worked on while you were there?
Wow. I started off in their research, they called it at the time their pilot plant or research and development semi-works in South Dallas. So I worked on a number of really cool projects. One great thing about Frito-Lay is they give you a lot of responsibility right out of the gate, right, very early on. So I was installing equipment. People may not remember the Wow chip. It was a Alestra. It was this oil that was supposed to be for low fat at the time, and rather than being absorbed in the body, it would pass through. Unfortunately, if you ate too many of the chips, everything passed through. So that didn't go over too well. It wasn't the greatest marketing when that came out. But I got to install and equipment for a line. I got to work on things like the Wow chips, Tostitos. I got to do that. I got to design a brand new or redesign an entire line of a chip called the Santitas. By the time I left Frito Lay, I moved up to the research and development, the headquarters in Plano after a year and a half. And by the time I left Frito Lay, 5.5, almost 6 years later, I was responsible for all of tortilla chip manufacturing across the United States, which at the time was 42 different manufacturing plants, which was cool, a lot of responsibility, but it also meant if there was any issues at any plant, you had to know the line, you had to know the equipment, the settings, and how to resolve it. And I could get a call at any time saying, a plant in Maryland is having an issue. We need you there tomorrow. Or a plant in California or Texas or wherever. And literally, I would get on a plane and fly to that plant and say, "What's the problem? Figure it out and resolve it before I left." So, the other big project that I worked on while I was at Frito Lay is Tostito Scoops. I was on the team, and the idea had been around in Frito for years. We were never able to get it to actually work, and I had worked on a couple of iterations of it, but I was on the team that actually launched Tostito Scoops, and I hold a patent for part of the process of Tostito Scoops. So I'm very proud of that. That's kind of my claim to fame.
As you should be. And who would have thought that you've gone from oil and gas and pharmaceuticals to tortilla chips? That's
Exactly.
quite a
Yeah.
pivot. And so, where did you find yourself after Frito-Lay?
Well, after Frito-Lay, I'd been living in Texas for a while. I'm originally from the East Coast, and I really wanted to move back to the East Coast, be closer to family, and Texas was hot. So I ended up getting a position with Campbell Soup in New Jersey, in Camden, New Jersey, working at their headquarters in R&D, working as a process research and development engineer, which was really cool. I got to do in Campbell's, most people don't realize they make a whole lot more than soup. So I learned so much. I went from basically frying and extruding and baked snacks to soups, sauces, beverages, refrigerated, frozen, aseptic. I got to work on, not just canned soup, but paste salsa, Prego spaghetti sauce, gravies, SpaghettiOs. They eventually bought Bolthouse Farms, so refrigerated juices, salad dressings. It ended up being, by the time I left, I was the director of commercialization for the Sea Fresh division, which was their whole fresh, healthy division. So I worked on salsas, hummus, high pressure processing. You name it, I've worked on it. Carrots, all, like they had Godiva chocolates at one point in time. I worked on Pepperidge Farm. I did a goldfish project. Worked with layer cakes, frozen layer cakes. So I got a chance to work on a lot of different types of products, processes, equipment, which was incredible. And just the breadth of experience, the breadth of different processes. And a lot of engineering goes into food, which most people do not realize. It's not as easy as, what you do at home. Stir it in a saucepan, add a little ingredients, turn on the heat, add some salt and pepper, and it's all good. When you can do that at home, maybe 4 or 5 pounds at a time, maybe 10 pounds. I was working on processes, and I still do, where somewhat in the food scientist comes up with the recipe, or the chef, they make 5, 10 pounds max on the stovetop. I scale that up to 300 to 3,000 pounds per hour, not or batch, and then per hour, and then up to 9,000 pounds per hour. So that is a lot of soup. That's a lot of salsa or spaghetti sauce. And nobody is stirring it. Nobody is pouring it. Nobody is chopping that many onions. That's all equipment, pumps, heat exchangers, things like that.
Wow, that's incredible. And such a breadth of experience that you have. And so you said that you ended up leaving Campbell's eventually. Where did you go after that?
After that, I was actually laid off because they sold the Sea Fresh division, and I decided, okay, I've been with Campbell's for almost 18 years. It had been a while, and I said, okay, I'm going to try consulting. I was in a position where I was like, I can take a year and do my own thing and see where that leads me. I've always wanted to try consulting. I'd worked with consultants, and I figured I know enough. I can do that. So I started trying developing my own consulting business. I got a few gigs, but it wasn't enough to replace a salary. And I wasn't getting, I was pitching to some clients, and I wasn't getting any hits, and a couple of things happened. My son, who was in the 6th grade at the time, broke his foot, and my husband got laid off. And I was like, whoa, whoa, we got to pay the bills here. So I took a job with a startup called Do Good Foods. And literally 2 days after I accepted their job offer, I got 3 consulting gigs all at the same time. So, of course, I did it all. I wasn't turning anything down at that point. But I ended up going to a startup, Do Good Foods, which has since gone defunct. It imploded after 4.5 years. But it was a startup. I was employee number 8. They had an idea. They had kind of a process. I was brought in and as the head of R&D. So I created a lab where I worked on the process, refined it, defined it, all of that. And then I had to create that lab, so which I had never done before. They had a big warehouse space, and I carved out 50 square feet. I ordered tables from eBay, like stainless steel tables and a sink. I ordered lab equipment off of Amazon, and figured out how to replicate this process that they had, with a partner company. Then I started to refine the process, and then COVID hit, which was a little crazy. And then they wanted to change the process. So we had to shut down operations because during COVID, everybody had to stay home. You couldn't work in a space by yourself, it's unsafe. I ended up bringing the equipment home and changing the process and doing it in my kitchen and in my garage. So we figured that out. And in the meantime, we're designing a manufacturing plant to make this process where they take leftover food from the stores, grind it up, and we called it upcycling. So meat, protein, vegetables, and fruit from grocery stores that would have gone to landfills, grind it up, put it through our process, and dry it and turn it into a shelf-stable, nutrient-dense powder, which eventually ended up being, it could have been any type of feed, but we ended up using it for chicken feed. So we redid the process through COVID in my kitchen. We're designing a plant. Then I had to create a pilot plant to scale this up to test out the process. They found a space in North Dakota. And so I found all the equipment wherever it was in the world to and bought it and shipped it to North Dakota. We had it installed, and then I started up their pilot plant there. So during COVID, while everybody else was at home, I was flying back and forth to North Dakota literally every other week for about a year and a half. And while we're scaling up the process, figuring it out, working out the kinks in North Dakota, we literally started to build a manufacturing plant in the middle of COVID. And got it built in a year and a half, which was an amazing feat in and of itself. We then started up that manufacturing plant. So we hired people. I learned how to work it because I was the process person. I ordered the equipment. We worked through all the sanitation in the pilot plant in North Dakota. And then I trained everyone on how to run. At first, I had to learn the equipment or in the process because it was almost fully automated. And then so I ran the plant and then trained all the operators, supervisors on how to run the plant, how to sanitize the plant, and created the quality lab in the manufacturing plant. We went up to about 120 employees, and then as the risk with startups, it pretty much imploded. We went too fast, spent too much money, and then one day they were just like, "We're shutting the doors, locking them, we're terminating operations at the plant and all of the employees." So it was a bit of a crazy ride. And after that, I went to Feastables, Mr. Beast chocolate company, which is where I am now. I am their director of process quality engineering and basically doing the same thing, scaling up, testing out the processes, finding the right equipment, and then also tracking it after it's launched in the co-mans and making sure they're making the right product. And that's all.
Wow, that's incredible. What a journey you've had. Just thinking culturally versus, these large legacy companies like Frito-Lay and Campbell's versus a startup or a smaller company. What has the culture been like for you in these experiences?
So at Frito-Lay has a very established, move fast because it's chips. You can make some changes and some things very quickly. It's not a hard or long process to develop. So that was interesting. It was with Frito-Lay, I learned, okay, if you can figure it out and come up with an idea, they gave you the leeway to just say, let's go launch this. Let's try this. Everybody give us your ideas, we'll pick the best one, and then we're just going to get it done. So it was very short lead times compared to pharma food. That's one of the reasons I love food CPG. The lead times are 6 to 9 months. You work on something and it's on the shelf. With Campbell's Soup, Campbell's is a huge older company, so it took longer to get some decisions made. Some depending on how complex the product is. Potato chips, tortilla chips are very straightforward. Some soups, processes, aseptic, or even frozen or refrigerated, the process in the food is more complex, so it took longer. But it was still usually about a year and a half or less, and you can get the product made on the shelf. But in an older company, a more established company, there are more silos. It's harder to get new ideas, try new things. And because they were over 100 years old, some of their plants were extremely old, and some of the equipment was extremely old. And they were different because they were all made at different times in different parts of the country. So trying to get the same thing made on in completely different equipment had its challenges, and trying to get some of those decisions made through those silos. They operated, it took a while to get up to senior leadership. It took a while to elevate. You had to keep having meetings and keep saying, okay, I'm going to pitch this idea, or I want to do this, or even ideas that you didn't have to pitch that you said, I just want to do it this way, which is different. Sometimes it took a very long time. It was the analogy of, trying to turn a speedboat. You just go, versus a cruise ship where it takes a while to make a turn. And then going to a startup where there's only 8 employees. You're talking to the owner and the CEO, and we would literally go to the break room, everybody stand around the table and say, okay, this didn't work. What do we do next? Let's try this. Okay, let's do it. It was like a huddle. And then you ran off and did it. So, and now in Mr. Beast company, it's a smaller company. And so it's not thousands of employees, it's 100 or a couple hundred at this point in time. When I started, I think it was about 60. I was like the 60th. But it's pretty quick. They make decisions. Smaller companies, it's much quicker, easier to make a decision to move forward. Sometimes that gets in our own way because we're making decisions so quickly, the communication just isn't there. But it's a lot faster pace, a lot easier, a lot of changes. So you have to be a lot more flexible with Campbell's, or even sometimes with a Frito-Lay. It's like, this is how we do it. You have to follow this process, and you could not deviate. Feastables doesn't always have that process in place yet, or startups are like, yeah, we'll make our own process as we go. And so you can move things a lot faster.
And so, having such a breadth of experience across the food industry, can
Mhm.
you speak a little bit to the diversity that you've experienced in all these different, or have seen in all these different companies and environments, and provide maybe some examples of ways you've been supported, or maybe ways you could have been better supported or better supportive of diversity?
Okay. Well, I will say with bigger companies, because they are larger, they have like the staff and HR. A lot of times they supported women, they supported minorities by having mentoring programs, by pairing you with a buddy, like when you first joined, when you're a new hire, to show you around and get you situated and acclimated and kind of show you the ropes. They also had employee resource groups. So for women, for minorities, for whichever, which kind of made you feel like, okay, there's a forum here to discuss, to support. They offered classes, things like that, which I found extremely helpful. And usually, still the makeup. There were, I would say, Frito-Lay is more of a younger company because of their target market is younger, at least at the time I was there. So they had most of the people there were really they were younger, more, so there were a lot more female engineers actually at Frito-Lay. When I went to Campbell's, there weren't as many female engineers. They definitely had them. The mix was it was still, I'd say, I don't know, 70% men, 30% women, which, but that was better. And with the startup, I was the only the only female for a very long time. So that was a completely different type of atmosphere. And with Feastables, I'd say it's a bigger company, but it's more remote. So, but I say because it's a younger company, it's a newer company, they're much more flexible. They have a very diverse and cultural mix with women, men. I'd still say for a while I was the only engineer. Now they've hired more. They're not working in that area, but there are more there. So a lot of times I was the only woman in the room. A lot of times, especially if you went out to a manufacturing plant, there were times where I went out to manufacturing plants, and this is in the 2000s, where they didn't have restroom facilities for women on the plant floor. They were in a different building. So if you had to like go to a different building to use the restroom as a woman. They had a men's room, but it was like, oh, we forgot. We hired some women later, and now they want to use the bathroom, which was amazing to me. Like I was shocked and stunned. So I would say there are a lot of times when you are the only woman, when you are the only Black woman or the Black person, especially on a technical team. And in manufacturing, there have been times where there's a team and it's a mix of women and men. And I have been the technical lead, the person in charge, and inevitably, almost every single time until they get to know me, the person from the plant, when it's the first time, they'll come up and say, okay, who's in charge? Mind you, I'm standing there with a clipboard telling everybody what to do, and they'll still turn to the man in the group, usually the older man in the group. And I have had times where people were literally shocked, like, you aren't the one in charge, it's this person. And I'm like, hey, yes, it's me. And it's like blown their mind, like they could not fathom that. And they still kept talking to the other person. And the other person was like, you got to ask her. I am not stepping into this. So I think it's gotten better over the years, which is great. I see more women coming into the field, coming into manufacturing. I'd love to see more. I'd still say um, they can't, a lot of times, depending on the company, and especially in smaller companies, if they just don't have those resources, the women aren't always supported. New hires right out of school should definitely be paired with someone that you know is open to that idea. And I have seen where that has not always happened and it did not work out well. You see a lot of people leaving manufacturing, leaving engineering. They have the degree, but they decide to either go back to grad school or work in a completely different area, whether it's supply planning or supply chain, HR, sales, somewhere where there's a better mix of women. So I'd love to see that change. I think women, some of the best engineers I've worked with have been women. the hardest workers, and the balance of, you have to balance family, you have to balance, but that's everybody. I don't think women should be penalized for that. But I think it's getting better. I will say that.
Absolutely. And so you bring up a lot of great points, especially in terms of this idea of mentoring. Did you benefit at all from a mentor throughout your career? And if so, or if not, like, have you, reached out to share your experience with younger women engineers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I have been in companies where they had a formal mentor program and they just match you with a person.
Mhm.
And that didn't always go well. I will say there have been times where I've definitely had mentors, which made all the difference in the world. They are supportive. I stay in touch with them even after I've left that organization. They offer encouragement, insight. They've, how to handle political situations, because a lot of times it's not the technical that you have trouble with, it's the political landscape, it's the relationship part of it. So when I think having a formal mentor program is great. However, it doesn't always work. Like, you don't always click with the person. You have to find someone you click with, and then the advice that they give, the advocating for you when you're not in the room, making suggestions of, oh, you should talk to this person in the organization, and then it's turned into a whole nother, not necessarily career path, but another position in another area, or a special project or projects for you to work on. Having a mentor is invaluable. Having an advocate, they're not always the same person, also invaluable. And it makes a world of difference. I think people should, even if you're paired with someone formally, also go find someone in addition to that. You can never have too many mentors, honestly, especially in your field. And they could be in different areas, not necessarily in your group or in your department, somewhere else in the organization or outside of the organization.
And so, having gone through this winding journey through your education, this winding journey through the food industry, do you have any other advice for women who are just embarking on their engineering careers?
Say be open, be flexible, be willing to try different things. And if you don't like something, move on. There are tons of areas to work in. You don't have to stay in an area where you're miserable or you have absolutely no interest, because you won't be doing your best and you won't be giving your best, and people can pick up on that. Be willing to relocate. Early in my career, I relocated. I followed the job, but I will also say it's not always about the money. Look at the company, do your research, talk to people, and you're also interviewing them. So understand the culture, and you can only learn so much during an interview if you're there for a day or so many hours or virtually. Reach out to other people, ask them, these are my concerns, or just ask, do your research on that company, be flexible. And, if it doesn't work, try something else. You don't always have to know exactly what you want starting out. You've at least in my experience, I've figured it out along the way by the process of elimination.
I think that's incredible advice for any industry, not just engineering.
Mhm.
And you touched on this a little bit, hoping to see more women engineers in the food
Mhm.
industry. Is there anything else that you'd like to see happen over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I'd like to see like those funnels created, not just for more women going into the industry, going into manufacturing, but starting out middle school, high schools. Go all the way back and say, and let people know these are options. Let the girls, the females know you can do this. And just because you're the only one in the room doesn't mean that you will always be the only one in the room. There are more coming after you. So I try to mentor, I try to reach out and talk to, give my number, and make myself available for people who have questions, are interested, and want to talk about it, or even just navigating a situation that they're in. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for making yourself available to me and sharing your story with our audience. I definitely appreciate it. And hopefully, we'll continue to see more and more women in the food industry.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I enjoyed speaking with you.
I enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks so much, Samara.
All right, bye.